Hello, and thanks for stopping by. During the Cold War, which lasted roughly from 1947, shortly after World War II, until the collapse of the USSR in 1991, London was a hotbed of espionage. Throughout that era, many Soviet spies and double agents lived and operated within the capital, exploiting the city's political connections, anonymity, and countless hidden corners as a means of divulging all manner of top-secret intel to the KGB. In this video, I'd like to share a collection of sites associated with London's Cold War spies with you, and as you'll soon see, they're places which you'd never imagine once played an important role in dictating the fate of the world. Sitting quietly by between its far busier neighbours at Euston and Camden Town, Mornington Crescent tube station is perhaps best known for its regular appearances on the long-running BBC4 comedy panel show I'm Sorry, I Haven't a Clue.
Now we're going to play the game called Mornington Crescent.
It was Mornington Crescent's unassuming nature which drew Yuri Mordin, a member of the Soviet NKVD, which was a precursor to the KGB, to the station when he was posted to London shortly after World War II. Mordin was responsible for overseeing members of the infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring, the likes of which included Kim Philby and Guy Burgess, and although plenty of spycraft involved communicating with simple notes delivered via the brush past or the use of dead letterboxes, more of which later, it was Mornington Crescent's tube station which Mordin often requested his agents report to whenever he wished to have a direct chat. In 1946, another spy named Klaus Fuchs, who, having worked on the Manhattan Project, was responsible for leaking crucial atomic secrets to Stalin's regime, was once asked to rendezvous at Mornington Crescent tube station as well, and to do so clutching a copy of Life magazine as an identifier. Klaus never turned up though, most likely because he feared he was being tailed, although his covert nuclear deeds, which are credited with ensuring the Soviets gained the atomic bomb a lot sooner than anticipated, would become linked with another station on the London Underground, that being Kew Gardens. Klaus was told that if he wished to make contact with his handlers, then he should head to Kew and toss a copy of Men Only magazine into a certain front garden close to the station, being sure to write instructions for the meetup on page 10. To indicate he'd done this, chalk marks were to be made in this alley just around the corner from the station, followed by another 2 marks on nearby Ennerdale Road and Holmesdale Road. However, if, as had been the case at Mornington Crescent, he feared he was being followed, and the situation was deemed too risky, then an alternative chalk mark was to be made between 2 shops outside Kew Garden Station itself as a warning. All very convoluted, isn't it? Klaus Fuchs also liaised with his Soviet handler in a number of London pubs. 2 that are known of are the Spotted Horse on Putney High Street and the Nag's Head up in Wood Green, right opposite Wood Green Tube Station. Do you think the horse theme was perhaps intentional? Another pub connected to espionage is the Red Lion on Duke of York Street, close to St James's Square. It was here, in the early 1960s, that Frank Bossard, an employee of the Aviation Ministry, would meet his KGB handler. Bossard was unmasked thanks to a tip-off from a Soviet double agent, the Ukrainian-born Dmitry Polyakov, codenamed Top Hat, who was a high-up in the Soviet's foreign military intelligence, but was secretly passing on intel to the CIA. Dmitry revealed that, through his meetings at the Red Lion, Frank Bossard had been handing over highly sensitive documents related to missile technology. The files she'd been providing were duplicates, which Bossard had created using specialist equipment whilst holed up in a room at the Ivanhoe Hotel on the corner of Great Russell Street, just a stone's throw from the British Museum. The Ivanhoe is now known as the Bloomsbury Street Hotel. When the copying equipment wasn't in use, Frank Bossard kept the gear stashed away in a luggage locker at Waterloo Station. Following this revelation, he was arrested in 1965 and eventually sentenced to 21 years in prison, although he died in 1978 whilst still incarcerated. Meanwhile, the man who'd given the tip-off, Dmitry Polyakov, was himself found out in 1988. To the Soviets, Dmitry's decades of dealings with the West amounted to treason, and he was promptly executed. Perhaps the most surprising case of espionage to occur in Cold War London was that of the Portland spy ring, for it was a matter which occurred out in the suburbs, the last place you'd expect such intrigue to lurk. The property at the centre of this tale was a bungalow on Cranley Drive, Ruislip, which in the late 1950s and early 60s was home to Helen and Peter Kroger, a supposedly Canadian couple who ran an antique book business at 190 Strand, opposite St Clement Danes RAF Church. In reality though, Helen and Peter Kroger were long dead. They'd been killed in a car crash in New Zealand years before, and rather ghoulishly, the pair living on Ruislip's Cranley Drive had assumed their names. Their real titles being Morris and Lona Cohen. Oh, and they weren't Canadian, they were American. Morris and Lona were married, that much was true, and together they'd been spying for the Soviets since World War II, their speciality being to pass on secrets related to US weapons technology. This included details of the atomic bomb, which they'd secured in conjunction with the erstwhile Klaus Fuchs. Klaus's activities had been discovered in 1950, after which, following a mere 90-minute trial at the Old Bailey, he'd been slapped with a 14-year prison sentence. This breach forced the Cohens to flee their home in New York, initially heading to Poland, then to London, where they settled in Ruislip under their new identities in 1954. Once in Britain, the Soviets hooked them up with Konon Molodoi, a Russian-born agent who spoke fluent English and was able to pose as a Canadian with ease, his cover being that he was a small-time businessman named Gordon Lonsdale, who imported jukeboxes and bubblegum machines. Molodoi had also recruited a fellow named Harry Houghton, who worked at the Admiralty's underwater weapons establishment at Portland in Dorset. With a checkered past and something of a drink problem, Harry was easy to manipulate, and he ended up slipping hundreds of documents to Molodoi, many of which related to the development of Britain's first nuclear submarine. Houghton would hand these items over on weekend trips up to London with his girlfriend Ethel G, after which they'd head to the West End for a show. Molodoi, meanwhile, would take the highly classified material to the Cohens' bungalow in Ruislip, for this was the heart of the operation, the base from which the team would send details of their finds back to Moscow via radio transmissions. The British authorities eventually gained wind of the ruse thanks to a tip-off from a Polish double agent named Michael Golanewski, codenamed Sniper. This resulted in MI5 putting a tail on Houghton, which in turn led them to Cranley Drive. A major surveillance operation was then put in place, with MI5 agents staked out on a property on nearby Courtfield Gardens, the residents of which were sworn to absolute secrecy. The sting paid off on the 7th of January 1961, when Harry Houghton, Ethel G, and Konon Molodoi were intercepted whilst exchanging secret documents held in a shopping bag outside the Old Vic Theatre just across from Waterloo Station. At the same time, back in Ruislip, the Cohens' bungalow was raided, turning up all manner of spy gear, everything from fake passports and microdots to a cigarette lighter kitted out with a hidden compartment, tailor-made for concealing cipher pads. It also turned out that the bathroom doubled up as a photographic darkroom. As a result, Houghton and G received 15-year prison sentences. The Cohens, or Krogers as they now called themselves, were also jailed, although they were soon sent to the USSR following a prisoner swap, and would later go on to be honoured on 2 Russian stamps. A similar operation was uncovered in 1988, when a Czechoslovakian spy named Václav Jelínek was raided at his home at 35 Silverbirch Close in Friar Barnet. Václav had been posted to London in 1975, where, using the pseudonym Erwin van Haarlem, he initially found cover working as a waiter at the Hilton on Park Lane. His first home in London was on Queensgate Gardens, and in 1983, he was tasked with garnering information on America's Strategic Defense Initiative, an ambitious missile defense shield which the press had dubbed Star Wars. It was in the mid-1980s, under his new guise as an art dealer, that Václav moved into his new address in Friar Barnet. His neighbours would later describe him as, quote, an oddball, and the alarm regarding his activities was raised by Václav's immediate neighbour, a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Saint, who noticed that, every evening at exactly 9:20 p.m, her television set would always be interrupted by strange beeping sounds. As the head of her local neighbourhood watch, Mrs. Saint considered it her duty to report this strange observance to the police. Before long, MI5, who no doubt already had their suspicions, had quietly moved into the area, and they placed Václav's flat under 24-hour surveillance. Then, on the morning of April 2nd, 1988, officers from Special Branch made their move. Using a skeleton key, they snuck into Václav's home and caught him red-handed. There, at the kitchen table, and still dressed in his pyjamas, the spy was hunched over a radio, scribbling down notes as he decoded a covert transmission known as a number station. Number stations are shortwave radio broadcasts which usually feature a synthesized voice dictating random strings of numbers, sequences which only the intended recipient, namely a spy in the field, can decode using a so-called one-time pad. During the Cold War, most number stations had their own identifying jingle, which, to outsiders tuning in, could sound rather uncanny. Perhaps the most infamous example being the so-called Swedish Rhapsody, which was broadcast from Poland, and, featuring the robotic voice of a young child, sounded very eerie indeed. You can still hear such broadcasts today if you know where to tune in, thus demonstrating that there are still indeed plenty of spies out there. Although without the unique decoder book, these strange transmissions are absolutely meaningless. It's believed the number station which Václav was receiving messages from on the morning he was caught at home in Barnet was the so-called Czech Lady, an example of which I'll play for you now. A key tool used in spycraft is the use of so-called dead drops, or dead letterboxes as they're also known. These being predetermined spots where notes and packages can be discreetly tucked away for collection. Václav Yevlenik, the spy we encountered in the last segment, admitted to using at least 2 such drops, one outside Golders Green Library and the other beside a garage on Willow Road in Hampstead. Perhaps the best known of London's dead letterboxes, which have since come to light, is one which was located within Brompton Oratory, close to the museum district in South Kensington. Inside this beautiful place of worship, KGB operatives would hide items behind a certain marble pillar, located on the right just as you enter through the main door. And there was another drop right behind Brompton Oratory, in the grounds of Holy Trinity Church, or more specifically, the gap between this tree and wall, just to the left of the statue of St Francis of Assisi. These two Brompton dead letter drops were well placed, as they happened to be located close to Harrods. In other words, if an agent felt they were being followed, then they'd make their way to the famous department store and lose their tail amongst the crowds of shoppers. It's also worth noting that Brompton Oratory is just a short walk from Daquise, London's oldest Polish restaurant, which has been sited beside South Kensington Tube Station since 1947. In the early 1960s, this eatery was frequented by Christine Keeler and Soviet naval attaché Yevgeny Ivanov, a relationship which caused quite a stir due to the fact that Christine was also embroiled in an affair with John Profumo, who, at the time, was the Secretary of State for War. Getting back to dead letterboxes, let's head now to Mayfair. There was another notable drop in this area. It was located beside a bench in the lovely Mount Street Gardens, daringly close to where the American Embassy used to be on Grosvenor Square. I'm not sure which bench exactly it was though. As you can see, there are quite a few here. If an agent squirreled something away in Mount Street Gardens, then they'd inform their handler by making a chalk mark on this exact lamppost, labelled number 2, which is a short walk away on Alderley Square. Perhaps the cheekiest dead letter drop though was in Coram's Fields, a well-known children's playground in Bloomsbury. This spot was employed by Colonel Oleg Gordievsky, a high-ranking KGB official who worked at the Soviet embassy in London during the 1970s and 80s. Oleg was in fact a deep-cover double agent who, disillusioned with communism, was in league with the West, and he was arguably their most vital asset, and he divulged information at regular meetings held in a small flat in Bayswater. His importance was best demonstrated in the autumn of 1983, when, against the backdrop of the Soviets shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007, an increasingly paranoid leadership, and a vast NATO military exercise named Able Archer, Oleg worked behind the scenes to defuse what was rapidly becoming a perilous situation, one which was threatening to push the world towards the brink of nuclear Armageddon. It was within Coram Fields, on one occasion, that Oleg hid a fake brick, the inside of which was stuffed with banknotes, intended for collection by an agent in the field. He used this spot as he had a young daughter at the time, and figured no suspicion would be raised if he was seen to take her here. By the spring of 1985, it was clear the Soviet leadership were onto Oleg, and following a daring escape from Moscow via the Finnish border, in which he was smuggled out in the boot of a car, he defected to Britain. A few years later, the former KGB colonel featured as a witness in the trial of a man named Michael Smith, who, being employed at the Hearst Research Centre, which was once based on East Lane in Wembley, was accused of passing documents to the Soviets related to radar technology and the Rapier missile system. At the trial, it transpired that Michael had also used a number of dead letter drops, most of which were dotted around Horsenden Hill in Ealing. Born in the Netherlands in 1922, George Blake lived quite a life. After serving with the Dutch Resistance and Royal Navy during World War II, he was posted to South Korea in a diplomatic role, although in reality he was undercover, tasked with gathering intel. Shortly after the Korean War erupted in 1950 though, Blake was captured by the Korean People's Army of the North, and ended up being held prisoner in Pyongyang. Whilst in North Korea, Blake bore witness to the horrific bombing campaign which was wreaked by the US upon the country. "I felt I was on the wrong side," he'd later say, and so decided to offer his services to the Soviets. George Blake was eventually released and returned to Britain in 1953. He was greeted a hero, and the gathered crowd couldn't have dreamt that they were in fact embracing a fully fledged KGB agent. Blake took up residence at 108 All Souls Place, just around the corner from the BBC HQ, and he gained employment with MI6. In this capacity, he went on to provide countless documents to the Soviets, which were handed over on street corners in Belsize Park, the auditoriums of darkened cinemas, and windswept platforms of deserted railway stations out in the suburbs. In short, Blake told the Soviets everything he was privy to, including the identities of several hundred agents working behind the Iron Curtain, around 40 of who ended up being executed. Blake's identity was finally revealed in 1961, thanks to intelligence provided by Michael Golonevsky, aka Sniper, the fellow we met earlier, who was responsible for unravelling the Portland spy ring. Once found out, he was recalled to the MI6 HQ, which in those days was at 54 Broadway, close to St James's Park, which incidentally is also home to the Tin and Stone Bridge, a picturesque spot which is also rumoured to have been used by spies and their handlers for covert meetups. Once apprehended, Blake was carted off to 2 Carlton Gardens, which happens to be the former home of Lord Kitchener, the famous face from the World War I recruitment posters, where he was interrogated for several days. Blake eventually cracked, and following a guilty verdict at the Old Bailey, he was sentenced to 42 years in prison, a record for the British legal system at that time. Even the then Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, noted in his diary that he believed this to be a savage sentence. Blake was then thrown in Wormwood Scrubs prison to begin his life behind bars. But he wasn't done yet. Early into his stretch, he befriended 3 Irish anti-nuclear protesters, Sean Bourke, Michael Randall, and Pat Pottle. This trio considered Blake's sentence to be, quote, inhumane, and after they were released, they hatched a plan to break their pal out of the scrubs. To do this, a pair of children's walkie-talkies were purchased from Hamley's toy store, one of which was smuggled into Blake to aid communication, and the date of the audacious escape was set for the 22nd of October 1966. That evening, during the prison's weekly film screening, Blake slunk back to his cell and broke the window. He then squeezed through the hole, dropped down onto a porch, and jogged to the perimeter wall, where his partners in crime had tossed over a long rope ladder, the rungs of which were fashioned from knitting needles. Blake scrambled over, and although he fractured his wrist in doing so, he'd made it to freedom and was quickly sped off to a safe house at 28 Highlever Road, less than a mile away from the prison. Over the next few months, Blake was hidden at other safe houses in London, including places in St John's Wood, Hampstead and Croydon, before being finally smuggled to East Berlin during the Christmas of 1966. He eventually ended up living in Moscow, where he remained until his death at the age of 98 in 2020. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at London's Cold War spy sites, and as always, I'd love to hear your own thoughts. Are you aware of any other spy sites in London? And if you were going to establish a dead letterbox, which location would you choose? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, would ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus, of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching, friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.